My name is Vera Cole. I'm 36 years old, and until recently, I believed I understood what home meant. Most people would describe me as steady, responsible, the dependable one. I work as a financial compliance analyst, quiet job, careful work, the kind that requires patience and attention to detail. I live in the margins of rooms. I notice what others overlook. I rarely interrupt. I don't raise my voice. And because of that, I've often been mistaken for someone who doesn't see what's happening. I've never been the dramatic sibling. That role belonged to my brother. He was always the charming one, the visionary, the risk taker, the one with potential. I was the practical one, the fallback plan, the person you call when something needs fixing, balancing, or stabilizing. If you had met us 2 years ago, you might have assumed he was the future, and I was the background. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic courtroom showdown or a screaming confrontation on the front lawn. It's about something quieter, something that unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, until it isn't invisible anymore. My brother secretly sold our only family home, the house our parents left behind, the place that held every birthday, every Christmas, every hospital return after our father's last surgery. He sold it to fund the lifestyle of a failing actress he insisted was on the verge of her big break. I didn't find out through a conversation. I didn't find out through honesty. I found out when debt collectors arrived with legal papers and metal seals for the doors. That was the morning I learned we were homeless. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about perception, about how people decide who you are and what you'll tolerate. It's about what happens when silence stops being submission and starts becoming strategy. I won't exaggerate. I won't turn anyone into a villain. People rarely see themselves that way. I'll tell you what happened the way it happened, slowly, quietly, piece by piece. If you've ever been the reliable one, the sibling who absorbs impact so others can stay comfortable, you may recognize parts of this journey. Have you ever realized too late that the role people assigned you was costing you more than you ever agreed to give? Before the house was sold, before the collectors, before I learned what silence can become, I was the reasonable one. That's how my brother described me to people. Vera's the stable one, he'd say with a half smile, as though stability were both a compliment and a limitation. She keeps things balanced, like a spreadsheet, like a table leg. I don't think he meant harm when he said it, but language has weight. And over time, weight shapes identity. Growing up in Manchester, our roles formed early. My brother Daniel was 2 years older, bright, charismatic, allergic to structure. Teachers forgave him because he was creative. Neighbors adored him because he was charming. Our parents worried about him constantly. No one worried about me. I did my homework. I showed up on time. I didn't experiment with rebellion. I learned to cook because Mom was tired. I learned to read contracts because Dad once said, "Someone in this house needs to understand paperwork." He laughed when he said it. I didn't. When our parents passed within 3 years of each other, first Dad, then Mom, the house became more than property. It became proof that something solid still existed. The red brick semi-detached on Alder Street wasn't grand, but it was ours. Mortgage paid off, no liens, no hidden surprises. Daniel talked about selling it once, casually, over takeaway cartons. "We could split the equity," he said. "Start fresh." I remember the way he said fresh, like the past was a burden instead of a foundation. I told him I wasn't ready. I said we should think carefully. He nodded as if I'd made a practical point, not an emotional one. The discussion drifted away, or so I thought. In the months that followed, he spent more time in London. He said he was helping someone with industry connections. That someone was a woman named Camille Hart, aspiring actress, independent film credits, big promises, bigger dreams. When Daniel spoke about her, his voice shifted. It carried urgency, investment, hope. When he spoke about me, it softened into familiarity. "Vera will handle it." Vera's good with that stuff. Vera doesn't mind. That last one lingered. I don't mind. It's a dangerous sentence. It trains people to assume elasticity, to assume you will bend, absorb, adapt. At family gatherings, what little remained of them, Daniel would recount stories of auditions, production meetings, and future premieres. I'd refill drinks, clear plates, answer practical questions about council tax and utilities. No one assigned me that role officially. I stepped into it because someone had to, but slowly, something shifted in how I was seen. I wasn't just reliable, I was expected. Predictable, emotionally neutral. When Daniel forgot to transfer his half of the insurance payment one month, I covered it. He apologized quickly, distracted. "You know I'll sort it," he said. I believed him. Not because of evidence, but because that's what older brothers are supposed to do eventually. Grow up. Step into responsibility. I didn't see then that I had already been assigned permanence in his life story. I was the stabilizer, the fallback net, the fixed coordinate while he moved. It never occurred to me that someone might see stability as an opportunity. If you are always the one who manages the details, do people start to believe the details don't belong to you? That was who I was to them. Dependable, quiet, safe, invisible in the places that mattered. The first cut didn't bleed. That's why I almost dismissed it. It happened on a Thursday evening in early spring. I remember because the air still carried that sharp chill Manchester refuses to release until May. I had come home from work later than usual, quarter-end compliance review, and found Daniel already in the kitchen. He was smiling at his phone. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the stack of documents beside him. Our documents. Property folder, insurance file. The thick maroon binder Dad had labeled in block letters. House. Original deeds and agreements. I paused in the doorway. "Oh," I said lightly. "What are you doing with that?" He didn't look up immediately. "Just organizing things." Organizing. Another harmless word. I walked closer and set my bag down. The binder was open to the title page. I recognized the watermark of the land registry. "Organizing for what?" I asked Musai. He exhaled through his nose, still smiling faintly at something on his screen. "Camille's agent thinks she might need proof of stability for a visa extension. I was just checking what assets are in my name." My name. I didn't react at first. Instead, I corrected gently. "It's in both our names." He waved a hand, dismissive but casual. "Joint ownership, yes, but it's basically mine too." Basically. The word landed differently than the others had. I remember leaning against the counter, arms folded, not defensive, just thinking. If anyone needs documentation, we can provide a certified copy. No need to take the originals out. He shut the binder then, too quickly. "You're always so cautious," he said, smiling in a way that suggested affection, but carried something sharper underneath. "Relax, Vera. I'm not selling the place." I hadn't accused him of that. That was the first cut. It wasn't about the documents. It was about the assumption beneath his tone, the slight edge of irritation at my question, as if oversight were mistrust, as if clarity were an obstruction. I replayed that conversation later in bed. Why did he shut the binder so fast? Why did he say, "I'm not selling the place," when I never suggested it? But then I rationalized. He was stressed. Camille's career wasn't taking off the way they'd hoped. Auditions were falling through. She needed reassurance. Daniel needed to feel useful. And I had always been the one who didn't escalate. So I let the moment dissolve. A week later, I received an email notification from our bank, an administrative alert regarding a document access request. Normally, both joint owners are notified if certified copies of property records are requested. This one listed Daniel as the sole requester. It wasn't illegal. Not yet. Joint owners can request documentation independently, but it was unnecessary. I considered asking him again. Instead, I drafted an email to our solicitor just to confirm that no structural changes had been filed against the property, no equity release, no mortgage application. Everything came back clean. I told myself that was enough. That was the second mistake. The first small cut isn't betrayal. It's discomfort. It's a sentence that doesn't sit right, a look that lingers half a second too long. It's the sense that you've been repositioned without consent. And if you've built your identity around being calm, you convince yourself that calm means quiet. I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't even press further. I told myself trust was stronger than suspicion. Sometimes the first cut isn't meant to hurt you. It's meant to measure how much you'll tolerate. Disrespect rarely announces itself. It seeps. After that Thursday evening, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no missing money, no legal notices, just small shifts in tone, timing, and transparency. Daniel began using phrases that repositioned the house as fluid instead of fixed. We could leverage it. It's just property. It's not like we're tied to it forever. Each sentence landed lightly in conversation, usually framed around Camille's next opportunity. A short film in Berlin, a workshop in Toronto, a producer in Los Angeles who just needed a little backing. Backing. The first time Daniel said that word, I asked, "What kind of backing?" He laughed softly. "Not you interrogating me again." It wasn't said harshly. That's what made it effective. He made curiosity feel like suspicion. Prudence feels like negativity. So I recalibrated. I asked fewer direct questions. I framed concerns as hypotheticals. If someone wanted to use the house as collateral, they'd need both signatures. I said once, almost academically. "Obviously," he replied. "You think I'd forge your name?" He held eye contact a second too long. Not angry, not guilty, just measuring. I dropped it. That became the pattern. He'd mention possibilities. I'd raise mild caution. He'd deflect with charm or mild irritation. I'd smooth the edges. It wasn't that I didn't notice. It was then that I began to normalize it. I told myself, he's under pressure. Creative industries are unstable. He needs encouragement, not resistance. Meanwhile, Camille started visiting more frequently. She was polite, but her politeness had an appraisal to it. Subtle, observant. The first time she walked through the house, she paused in the living room. "This place has good bones," she said. "It could fund something bigger." Fund something bigger. I watched Daniel's face when she said that. Hope flared there. Validation. I made tea. Over time, conversations about our house became conversations about what's possible. Daniel would talk about equity like it was dormant energy. Untapped capital, just sitting in bricks and mortar. "You think small gets you work small," he told me once. Not cruelly, almost philosophically. Risk is how people move forward. I could have responded sharply. I didn't. Because part of me wondered if he was right. Had I mistaken caution for wisdom? Was I clinging to sentimentality disguised as practicality? That's how disrespect embeds itself. It makes you question your baseline. Bills started arriving addressed only to him. Investment newsletters, property advisory mail, consultation confirmations. When I asked casually what they were about, he'd say, "Just exploring options." Exploring, always harmless words. The subtle shift was this. I stopped expecting full transparency. And once you stop expecting something, people stop offering it. The house felt different then. Not physically, emotionally, as if it were being discussed in rooms I wasn't in, as if decisions were forming in conversation threads I never saw. But nothing had technically happened. No sale, no mortgage, no legal change, which meant I had no solid ground for objection. So I did what I'd always done. I maintained, paid utilities on time, renewed insurance, reviewed council tax adjustments. Quiet stewardship. Daniel mistook that for passivity. Camille mistook that for indifference. What neither of them noticed was that I had started observing differently. Not emotionally, structurally. Patterns, timing, gaps. When someone gradually shifts your position in a story, you can either argue for the old role, or you can begin preparing for a different one. At that point, I still believed this was a misunderstanding, a phase, a stress response. I hadn't yet accepted that normalization is not accidental. It's a rehearsal. There's a moment when you stop asking what's happening and start asking who you've become in someone else's version of events. For me, that realization arrived quietly. It wasn't sparked by a document or a confession. It was sparked by a dinner. Camille had invited a small group of industry friends over. Writers, a casting assistant, someone who claimed to be developing a streaming project. The house was clean. I'd spent the afternoon tidying without being asked. Habit. When guests arrived, Daniel introduced me the way he always did. "This is Vera. She keeps everything running." Not my job title, not my sister, not even co-owner. She keeps everything running. The room nodded politely, already drifting back to conversations about funding rounds and screen tests. I refilled glasses, I carried plates, I listened. At some point, someone asked Daniel, "So how are you financing all this travel?" He smiled easily. "We've got assets." I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and living room, a tray balanced on my palms. No one looked at me. Camille added lightly, "It helps when stability exists in the background." Background. That word didn't sting, it clarified. Later that evening, after everyone left, I washed dishes while Daniel scrolled through his phone. "You didn't mention my name when they asked about financing," I said calmly. He shrugged. "It's implied." Implied. "You described the house as assets," I continued. "It is an asset," he replied. "That's what it is on paper." There it was. The reframing is complete. Home had become a line item. Memory had become leverage. And I had become infrastructure. Not consulted, not central, structural. The role assigned to me wasn't accidental. It was efficient. Reliable sibling, financially literate, emotionally composed, unlikely to cause a scene. Perfect for absorbing risk without obstructing ambition. The more I reflected, the more I saw how consistently that narrative had been reinforced. When Dad passed, I handled probate paperwork. Daniel grieved publicly, I processed forms privately. When Mom's health declined, I coordinated appointments. Daniel made grand speeches about family unity. When bills were due, I paid first and followed up later. No one asked me to. I volunteered. And volunteers, over time, the revelation wasn't painful, it was mathematical. If someone believes you will always stabilize the consequences of their decisions, they begin to calculate accordingly. That night, standing at the sink, I realized something else. I had mistaken being needed for being valued. Needed is functional, valued is intentional. I was functional. The role was clear now. Absorb shock, maintain continuity, ask minimal questions, trust implicitly. What unsettled me wasn't Daniel's ambition, it was his assumption. He assumed I would never withdraw support. He assumed I would never shift position. He assumed my steadiness was permanent. That assumption was the foundation beneath every casual remark about leveraging, exploring, and backing. Not malice, certainty. And certainty can be more dangerous than hostility. Because hostility expects resistance. Certainty does not. That evening, for the first time, I stopped defending my silence internally. Instead, I examined it. Was I quiet because I trusted him, or because I had accepted a role I never consciously agreed to play? The difference matters, because once you recognize the script, you can decide whether to continue performing it. The shift didn't happen when the debt collectors arrived. It happened weeks earlier, in a room that smelled faintly of dust and radiator heat. I had taken a half-day off work to retrieve some archived documents from the upstairs study, old tax filings from our parents' final year. The study had always been Dad's domain: heavy oak desk, filing cabinet with a drawer that stuck halfway unless you lifted it slightly. I remember sitting cross-legged on the carpet, folders spread around me, when I noticed something out of place. The metal file box labeled property. Originals felt lighter. Not dramatically, just enough. I opened it. The original title deed wasn't there. At first, I assumed I'd misplaced it during some previous review. I checked the maroon binder downstairs. Empty sleeve. No document. My pulse didn't spike. That surprised me. What rose instead was a kind of stillness. I went to my laptop. Land registry records can be accessed online for a small fee. I had done it before for work, verifying ownership for compliance reviews. The system is straightforward if you know what to search for. I typed in our address. I paid the access fee. I downloaded the updated title summary. Ownership, transferred. Completion date, 6 weeks prior. Seller, Daniel Cole and Vera Elise Cole. Buyer, a private holding company registered in London. My name was listed as a transferring party. My digital signature appeared in the documentation record. I stared at the screen for a long time. The signature looked like mine at a glance, close enough that most people wouldn't question it. But I know my handwriting. The pressure points were wrong. The angle is too steep. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. He hadn't even asked again. He had simply acted. I leaned back against Dad's desk and let the information settle without panic. There's a specific kind of betrayal that doesn't feel explosive. It feels clarifying. All the small cuts rearrange themselves into a pattern. Document requests, asset conversations, certified digital copies, sudden optimism about funding. He hadn't leveraged the house. He had sold it. And because the transaction had completed legally, at least on paper, there was no dramatic warning. No eviction notice pinned to the door yet. That would come later, once occupancy terms expired. The house had likely been sold under an agreement allowing temporary residency before final possession. Strategic, quiet. I should have felt rage. Instead, I felt something colder and more precise. He believed I would never check. That was the moment something shifted, not externally, but internally. For years, I had operated from trust as default. Now I understood that trust in this context had been treated as a resource. Exploited, not honored. I printed the documents. I didn't confront him that night. He returned home late, distracted, energized about Camille's breakthrough audition. I listened. I nodded. I watched him speak with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes a bridge has been crossed unnoticed. That night in my room, I laid the printed pages on my desk. Fraud, misrepresentation, potential criminal liability, civil implications, joint ownership violation. My training in compliance didn't scream for emotional justice. It outlined the process. Options. Leverage. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like infrastructure. I felt informed. And information changes posture. The shift wasn't anger. It was alignment. I was no longer reacting to tone or implication. I was responding to the fact. The house was gone, but something else had returned. Clarity. When someone removes your foundation without telling you, do you collapse? Or do you examine the blueprint they assumed you'd never read? The next morning, I made breakfast. That may sound insignificant, but it was deliberate. Daniel came downstairs humming, unusually light. He poured coffee, checked his phone, and talked about Camille's upcoming callback in Brighton. His voice carried anticipation, the kind that comes when someone believes they've secured momentum. I listened. I did not mention the land registry. I did not ask about the holding company. I did not reference the forged signature resting inside my desk drawer upstairs. That was the first day my silence became intentional. There's a difference between not speaking because you're unsure and not speaking because you're deciding. Daniel mistook my calm for ignorance. That worked in my favor. Over the following week, I adjusted small behaviors. I stopped automatically covering shared expenses. When the electricity bill arrived, I forwarded his half with a neutral note. Please transfer by Friday. He responded hours later. Since when are we being formal? 6 weeks ago, I thought. Out loud, I wrote. Just keeping things organized. He transferred the money. Camille began spending more nights at the house. She talked openly now about the London move. I noted the phrasing. You'll love it, she told Daniel one evening while I sat at the dining table reviewing documents. Once the funds settle properly, everything will feel real. Funds settle properly. That phrase confirmed what the paperwork already had. The transaction hadn't fully liquidated yet. Likely staged payments, perhaps escrow, which meant timelines existed. And timelines create opportunity. I started waking earlier. Instead of scrolling through news before work, I reviewed property law cases over coffee. Not abstractly. Specifically, joint ownership disputes, fraudulent signature precedents, remedies available when a co-owner sells without valid consent. The law is rarely dramatic. It is procedural. Procedures favor the prepared. At work, I requested access to a continuing education seminar on financial misconduct tracing, framed it as professional development. No one questioned it. I was known for diligence. At home, I observed without reacting. Daniel began testing the narrative publicly. "We're probably relocating soon," he told a neighbor one afternoon. "Exciting changes." The neighbor looked surprised. "Selling up?" "Something like that," he replied vaguely. I was standing at the window. He didn't glance back. That was the assumption again, that I would follow wherever he decided. My silence unsettled him slightly by the end of the second week. I could see it in small glances, pauses mid-sentence as if waiting for an objection. I offered none. Instead, I asked neutral logistical questions. Do you have copies of the completion statements? Have you considered tax implications for capital gains? Each question was delivered evenly, not accusatory, technical. He waved them away. It's handled. Handled. I let that word hang between us. What he didn't notice was that I had scheduled a consultation with a solicitor specializing in property litigation. Discreet, off the books, using personal leave. Silence is often interpreted as surrender, but when silence is paired with information gathering, it becomes architecture. I was no longer trying to preserve the illusion of shared decision-making. I was mapping the terrain of accountability. The house still stood around us, brick walls, familiar creaks, the scent of old wood polish. But legally, it was already someone else's. Daniel believed the transition would be smooth, that I would absorb it the way I had absorbed every previous oversight. He did not understand that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer asking whether he would fix this. I was deciding what I would do about it. And decisions made in silence tend to surprise the loudest voices in the room. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. Daniel continued living as though momentum favored him. Camille spoke more openly about their next chapter. There were brochures from letting agencies in London on the kitchen counter. Vision boards are pinned in the spare room. Optimism layered over everything like fresh paint. What they never noticed was that I had stopped reacting emotionally altogether. Instead, I was documenting. The first thing I did after confirming the fraudulent transfer was secure the evidence properly. No screenshots on my phone, not casual printouts, certified copies of the updated title, transaction references, corporate registry details of the holding company that had purchased the house. The company's directors were listed publicly. One name stood out, an investor previously associated with short-term asset flips, properties acquired under pressure and resold quickly at a margin. That suggested our house had likely been priced below market value for speed, which meant urgency. Urgency leaves fingerprints. I didn't accuse Daniel. I didn't search his drawers. I didn't confront Camille. I reviewed timelines. Completion date, 6 weeks prior. Vacant possession clause, effective in 3 months. Temporary occupancy agreement, implied. That meant we had approximately 6 weeks before enforcement. I scheduled a meeting with the solicitor I had researched, Ms. Eleanor Graves. I brought a slim folder. Calm posture, no theatrics. She examined the documents carefully. "Did you sign this?" she asked. "No." She nodded once, not surprised. "Then we have leverage." Leverage is a word most people use casually. In the legal context, it means structured pressure. Ms. Graves outlined options: immediate injunction to freeze further disposition of the property, formal fraud complaint, civil action against Daniel for misrepresentation and damages, negotiated settlement before litigation. Each path had consequences. For him, for me, for timelines. I asked precise questions: processing time, financial exposure, risk thresholds. She asked why I hadn't confronted him. "Because," I said evenly, "confrontation would warn him before preparation is complete." She studied me for a moment, then gave a small, approving nod. Back at the house, nothing outwardly changed. Daniel grew increasingly buoyant. He mentioned Camille's industry showcase twice in 1 week. He ordered a new jacket. Expensive, unnecessary. I transferred my personal savings into a separate protected account. I updated my employment contract file. I reviewed tenancy laws. I also requested, quietly, a valuation of the house through a separate surveyor. Independent, confidential. The number came back higher than I expected, significantly higher than the sale price listed in the transaction record. Below market sale, which strengthened the case. What they never noticed was that I stopped filling the role of emotional reassurance. When Daniel vented about casting directors, I listened but did not soothe. When Camille spoke about manifesting abundance, I offered no polite affirmation. I was polite, but I was absent. Emotionally, I had stepped outside the frame. One evening, Daniel asked casually, "You've been quiet lately. Everything all right?" "Yes," I replied. And for the first time, it wasn't a deflection. I was all right, because uncertainty had been replaced with data. They never noticed that I had begun scanning for assets linked to Daniel personally, accounts, transfers, unexplained deposits, not illegally, through public filings, observable patterns, and information voluntarily shared in his own casual boasting. He underestimated two things: my profession, my memory. Every time he mentioned an amount, a date, a promise from Camille's agent, I logged it mentally. Not to weaponize, to understand. Preparation is rarely glamorous. It is repetitive, quiet, almost boring. But quiet competence unsettles chaos more than anger ever could. By the end of that month, I possessed proof of forged signature, evidence of below-market sale, documentation of staged payment timeline, legal counsel ready to act. Daniel believed he had executed a decisive move without resistance. He didn't realize the board had shifted. What they never noticed was that I had stopped being infrastructure. I had become a strategy. The reveal didn't happen in our kitchen. It didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a quiet office with beige walls and a window that overlooked nothing remarkable. Ms. Graves slid a document across the desk toward me. "Before we proceed formally," she said, she said, "you should see this." It was a financial disclosure tied to the purchasing company, obtained through lawful inquiry once potential fraud had been indicated. The final installment of the property payment had not yet been released. It was being held in escrow, pending confirmation of undisputed transfer, which meant the transaction was incomplete in the most important sense. Daniel had likely received an initial lump sum, enough to impress, enough to spend, enough to convince Camille that momentum was real. But the majority of the equity, the life-changing portion, was still suspended, waiting for my confirmation. I read the clause twice to be certain. The buyer required written acknowledgement from both former owners that no disputes existed regarding signature validity or consent. My forged signature was attached to the transfer, but my independent acknowledgement had not yet been filed, which meant I was the missing piece. I felt no surge of triumph, only clarity. Daniel had built an illusion on a partial foundation, and illusions collapse quietly when the final signature never arrives. Ms. Graves outlined the position precisely. If we notify the escrow holder of disputed consent before final disbursement, funds freeze immediately. The buyer will initiate a review. Your brother will be required to respond. Depending on findings, the sale could be rescinded, renegotiated, or converted into damages liability. And if I do nothing? I asked. Then the remaining funds will be released within weeks. Vacant possession proceeds. You'll likely face enforcement once occupancy terms expire. So this was the fulcrum. Not emotional confrontation, not public exposure. A document, or the absence of one. I walked back through Manchester streets afterward, feeling oddly light. The city moved as it always did. Buses sighing at stops, rain threatening but not committing. At home, Daniel was animated. Camille's showcase went brilliantly, he said. Investors were there. Real investors. I listened. He talked about moving timelines forward, about how once everything clears, they'd finally feel secure. I wondered whether he knew how conditional his security truly was. That evening, Camille poured wine and said casually, "You're being very calm about all this change, Vera." I met her gaze evenly. Change requires paperwork. She laughed lightly, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. The private reveal wasn't that Daniel had sold the house. I already knew that. The reveal was that control had not transferred fully. He believed the decisive action had already happened. In reality, the decisive action had yet to occur, and it belonged to me. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. Our childhood home had still been leveraged without consent. Trust had still been fractured. But now the structure of the response was visible. I had 3 immediate choices. File a dispute immediately, freeze funds, trigger investigation, approach Daniel privately with evidence, negotiate surrender of proceeds, allow funds to be released, then pursue civil action afterward. Each path carried a cost, emotionally, legally, financially. I went upstairs and placed the escrow clause document beside the forged signature on my desk. 2 pages, 2 realities. One was built on an assumption, one built on verification. The power in that moment was not explosive. It was quiet. For the first time since discovering the sale, I wasn't reacting to betrayal. I was deciding the outcome. And decisions made from clarity rarely require raised voices. I slept deeply that night, because the house might have been sold. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes before an irreversible choice. Not panic, not anger, just awareness that once something is set in motion, it cannot be undone. For 3 days, I carried the escrow clause folded inside my notebook. I went to work. I attended meetings. I reviewed compliance reports. Outwardly, nothing shifted. Inwardly, everything aligned around one question. What outcome do I want? Not what punishment he deserves. Not what would embarrass him most. What outcome preserves my integrity? That distinction mattered. If I filed the dispute immediately without warning, Daniel would experience shock. The funds would freeze, investigations would begin, Camille's projected stability would evaporate overnight. The narrative he had been building would collapse. If I confronted him privately first, I would give him time to maneuver, time to prepare excuses, time to transfer remaining accessible funds beyond reach. If I waited until final disbursement, I would risk prolonged litigation and greater instability for myself. The practical answer was obvious: file immediately. But decisions like this are rarely purely practical. I sat alone in the study one evening, the same room where I'd discovered the missing deed. Dad's old desk is beneath my palms. The house around me is humming with the familiarity of decades. I thought about childhood mornings on these stairs, Mum's laughter from the kitchen. Daniel and I are racing to claim the larger bedroom. Memory complicates justice. I did not want to destroy my brother. I wanted accountability. There is a difference. Accountability is corrective. Destruction is emotional. If I filed, the transaction would not vanish instantly. It would trigger the process. Review, examination, truth would surface. Not because I shouted, but because documentation required it. I realized something then. Daniel's greatest assumption wasn't that I wouldn't notice. It was that I wouldn't act. He believed my moral code prioritized harmony above fairness. He was wrong. My moral code prioritizes responsibility, and responsibility includes consequences. The next morning, I scheduled a follow-up with Ms. Graves. "I'm ready," I told her. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Yes." We prepared the formal notice of disputed consent. It was precise, clinical, no emotional language, just facts. Signature invalid. Consent not granted. Transaction under review. Immediate freeze requested pending investigation. I signed my name carefully, my real signature, not rushed, not angled, steady. As the document was transmitted electronically to the escrow holder and the purchasing company's legal representative, I felt no surge of victory, only inevitability. The irreversible choice had been made. I returned home that evening to find Daniel discussing potential flat viewings in London. He was optimistic, confident. He did not yet know that the foundation beneath that confidence had shifted. I watched him for a moment, not with anger, with clarity. The decision point is rarely loud. It is the quiet moment when you stop hoping someone else will correct their mistake and accept that you must correct the structure they built around it. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply ensured that truth entered the room through the proper channel. And truth, when filed correctly, moves with its own momentum. The freeze order went out on a Tuesday. Daniel didn't notice that day, or the next. That's the thing about structural consequences. They travel through systems before they arrive in living rooms. I continued exactly as before. I left for work at 8:10 a.m. I returned around 6:30 p.m. I prepared simple dinners. No altered tone, no hidden tension in my posture. Silence, when intentional, requires discipline. On Thursday evening, Daniel received a call. I knew it was significant because he stepped outside to take it, a behavior he rarely adopted in our own house. Through the front window, I could see him pacing, one hand pressed against his forehead. When he came back in, his expression was carefully neutral. "Minor paperwork delay," he said casually, heading straight for the kitchen. "Something about confirmation signatures." I nodded once. "Administrative things take time." He watched me for a fraction longer than usual. The following morning, I received confirmation from Ms. Graves. The escrow account had been formally frozen pending investigation. The purchasing company's legal team had requested documentation. A review of signature authentication had been initiated. Structured, methodical. Daniel's second call came that afternoon. This one lasted longer. His voice, when he returned inside, carried a strain he tried to suppress. "They're questioning procedural technicalities," he said, avoiding direct eye contact. Apparently, one of the confirmations wasn't filed properly. I set down the tea towel slowly. "Which confirmation?" He hesitated. "Yours." I let silence stretch just enough to feel deliberate. "I don't recall filing any confirmation," I replied evenly. His jaw tightened. "That's impossible," he said quickly. "You signed at the solicitor's office." "No," I said. "I didn't." There was no heat in my voice, no accusation, just a statement. For the first time in years, Daniel looked uncertain around me. He opened his mouth as if to argue, then stopped. His mind was recalculating, running through possibilities, assessing exposure. That evening, Camille did not come over. Daniel stayed in his room longer than usual, making calls. The energy in the house shifted, not explosively, but densely, like pressure building behind walls. The next day, an official letter arrived addressed to both of us. Notice of disputed transfer, temporary hold on funds, request for verification interview. Daniel read it standing in the hallway. He looked smaller, not because I had humiliated him, not because I had shouted, because the structure he thought was complete had been paused midair. "You went behind my back," he said finally. The irony didn't require comment. "I went through the proper channels," I replied. "You could have talked to me." I tried, I said quietly, multiple times. He looked at me as if seeing a version of me he hadn't accounted for. Calm, informed, unmoved by deflection. I did this for us, he said, softer now. For opportunity. You did this without consent, I answered. The conversation did not escalate. There was no shouting, just the slow realization settling between us that silence no longer meant compliance. Over the following week, I continued moving quietly. I secured a short-term rental option in my name alone, just in case enforcement accelerated. I updated my financial protections. I prepared documentation for the authentication review. Daniel, meanwhile, scrambled. Phone calls, emails, attempts to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. But systems don't respond to charm. They respond to evidence. And evidence, once submitted, doesn't retract itself out of sympathy. Moving in silence meant something simple. I did not chase reaction. I allowed the process to unfold. And process, unlike emotion, does not negotiate based on discomfort. The house still stood around us, but its future now depended on verification, not assumption. For the first time since childhood, Daniel wasn't certain what would happen next. I was. Consequences rarely arrive with sirens. They arrive as interruptions. The first interruption came in the form of silence, from Camille. She stopped visiting. Her messages to Daniel, once frequent and effusive, became shorter, more measured. The optimism in her tone flattened into logistical questions. When will the funds clear? Is the issue serious? Are we still on schedule? Schedule. That word had once energized him. Now it sounded like a countdown. Daniel spent longer hours outside the house. When he was home, he moved restlessly between rooms. Phone calls happened in whispers. I overheard fragments. And just procedural, temporary hold. Sorting it out. He still believed resolution meant smoothing over irregularities. But the review process had escalated. Signature authentication requires formal verification. I provided handwriting samples. Timeline documentation. Confirmation of absence from any solicitor appointment on the stated transfer date. Facts are patient. They don't need embellishment. 2 weeks into the freeze, a second letter arrived. This one is addressed specifically to Daniel. Preliminary findings indicated a material discrepancy in signature execution. Further inquiry pending. He read it standing in the kitchen this time. No attempt at composure. This is ridiculous, he muttered. They're overreacting. I continued preparing dinner. You understand what this means? He asked suddenly, turning toward me. Yes, I said calmly. It means they're verifying consent. You're making this bigger than it needs to be? No, I replied. I'm making it accurate. Accuracy is uncomfortable when someone has relied on approximation. The financial strain became visible next. Without final disbursement, Daniel's liquidity was thinner than I'd anticipated. The initial payment, likely already committed to deposits, travel, lifestyle signaling, had been enough to project success, not sustain it. Camille's showcase required additional fees, travel costs, marketing contributions. He hesitated before transferring them. She noticed. The shift in her tone when she did visit briefly was subtle but undeniable. Less admiration, more assessment. Investors don't like instability, she said one evening, glancing around the living room as if it no longer symbolized opportunity but complication. Daniel nodded tightly. For the first time, he experienced what I had lived with for years, the quiet pressure of being expected to stabilize someone else's vision. Neighbors began asking questions. Heard there was a sale. Everything all right? Daniel deflected with practiced ease, but the ease thinned. Meanwhile, official correspondence continued. The purchasing company, concerned about exposure, signaled potential rescission of the sale pending the outcome. If rescinded, funds would be returned, title restored, legal costs assessed. Against him, I watched the weight accumulate, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. This is what unexamined certainty looks like when tested. One evening, he stood in the doorway of the study while I reviewed documents. You're not even angry, he said quietly. I looked up. Anger wouldn't improve accuracy. He shook his head. You could have ruined me. I still can, I said evenly, but that isn't the goal. He absorbed that. Consequences are rarely dramatic explosions. They are incremental losses of control, loss of narrative, loss of assumed support, loss of imagined future. Camille called less. Investors hesitated. The purchasing company demanded clarity. Daniel, once expansive in speech, grew cautious. For years, I had absorbed the cost of his risk. Now he was encountering its structure directly. Not because I attacked him, because I declined to cushion the impact. And once cushioning disappears, gravity feels different. Panic does not arrive loudly in someone like Daniel. It seeps into posture. By the third week of the investigation, the purchasing company's legal team had escalated the matter. They requested a formal in-person verification session. Both of us were required to attend separately. Daniel tried to reframe it. It's just procedural cleanup, he said, though his hands moved restlessly as he spoke. Once we clarify things, they'll release the funds. I didn't argue, because by then, he already knew release was unlikely. Signature analysis had come back inconclusive in his favor. The angle, the pressure inconsistencies, the timing discrepancy, none of it aligned with voluntary execution. The buyer, understandably, had grown cautious. They had no interest in acquiring a property tangled in potential fraud litigation. And investors, especially the kind Daniel had aligned himself with, avoid uncertainty. Camille stopped staying over entirely. Her messages shifted tone again. This isn't what I signed up for. I can't afford delays right now. I need stability. Stability? The word echoed with quiet irony. Daniel began pacing at night. I could hear the floorboards above my bedroom. Phone calls grew more urgent. At one point, he knocked on my door. Can we talk? He asked. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. I didn't think you'd take it this far, he said. This far? I repeated calmly. To lawyers? To freeze everything? You took it to lawyers first, I replied. You just didn't inform me. He exhaled sharply. I was going to tell you. When? Silence. He shifted tactics. Camille's career depends on this. We were close to something real. I studied him carefully. And that required removing my consent? It was temporary, he said quickly. I would have fixed it before you even noticed. That sentence clarified everything. He had not underestimated my intelligence. He had underestimated my attention. Daniel, I said evenly, you forged my signature on the sale of our parents' home. Hearing it stated plainly stripped away narrative cushioning. He looked at the floor. I thought you'd understand eventually. That isn't understanding, I replied. That's an assumption. He ran a hand through his hair. If the sale collapses, I'll owe penalties, legal costs, reputation damage. Yes, I said. And Camille, he trailed off. I didn't finish the sentence for him. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to apologize. It means too late to avoid consequences. Over the next week, the buyer formally signaled intent to rescind unless full consent verification was obtained. Daniel could not provide it. The holding company prepared withdrawal terms. Funds, what remained untouched, would be returned to escrow keying pending resolution of damages and legal fees. The sale, effectively, was unraveling. Camille sent one final message that I accidentally saw when Daniel left his phone on the counter. I can't build a future in instability. Call me when things are settled. She did not visit again. Daniel sat at the kitchen table that evening longer than usual. No phone calls, no pacing, no optimism. Just stillness. This wasn't supposed to happen, he said quietly. I believed him, but intent does not rewrite structure. He had constructed a future on assumed silence. When silence withdrew, the structure failed. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, and procedure does not reverse itself out of regret. The final conversation didn't happen in anger. It happened on a Sunday morning with rain against the windows and cold tea between us. The buyer had formally withdrawn. The sale was rescinded pending settlement of legal costs and penalties. Title restoration was in motion. The house, at least legally, was returning to joint ownership, but not without damage. Daniel had absorbed financial loss, deposits forfeited, professional credibility questioned, Camille gone. We sat at the dining table where, months earlier, he had spoken about assets. Now there were no grand visions, just paperwork. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I believed that too. Harm is often collateral in ambition. You didn't mean to, I agreed. You calculated that I wouldn't object. He flinched slightly. I thought you trusted me. I did, I replied. Trust doesn't eliminate consent. Silence settled again. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. Not dramatic, not tragic, just aware. I was trying to build something bigger, he said. I didn't want to be stuck here forever. And I didn't want to lose the one thing our parents left us, I said calmly. We held eye contact. For once, neither of us tried to persuade the other. There was nothing left to argue. You could report me, he said quietly. Pursue charges. I could, I acknowledged. Why aren't you? Because destruction had never been my objective. I wanted the house protected, I said, and the truth acknowledged. He nodded slowly. That's it? He asked. That's it. No shouting, no dramatic ultimatum, just a recalibration of boundaries. I need you to understand something, I continued. I will never again assume shared decisions. If this property changes in any way, it will require documented in-person consent with independent representation. He absorbed that carefully. Understood, he said. And Daniel, I added, my voice steady, if you ever position me as background infrastructure again, I won't correct you quietly. That wasn't a threat. It was information. He gave a small, almost resigned nod. In that moment, I realized something important. This confrontation wasn't about reclaiming dominance. It was about redefining presence. For years, I had allowed my reliability to be interpreted as permission. Now it was clear. Reliability does not equal compliance. Calm does not equal consent. Silence does not equal surrender. We finished our tea in quiet. The house felt different. Not because it had been lost and returned, but because its ownership was now consciously defined. Daniel would have to rebuild aspects of his life. Financially, professionally, emotionally. That was his responsibility. Mine was simpler, to ensure that my steadiness would never again be mistaken for invisibility. And that lesson required no raised voices. The house still stands on Alder Street. Same red brick, same narrow hallway, same faint creak on the third stair from the bottom. But I no longer move through it the way I used to. Before, I carried it like a responsibility. Now I carry it like a choice. Daniel and I restructured the ownership formally. Legal safeguards are in place. Dual signature requirements reinforced. Independent representation clauses added. It's less romantic now, more precise. Precision brings peace. He moved out 3 months after the sale was rescinded. Not in anger, not in exile, simply a necessity. He needed distance from the house, from the memory of the investigation, from the version of himself that believed shortcuts were invisible. We speak occasionally, carefully. There is less assumption in his tone now, less certainty that I will absorb the impact. As for Camille, her name rarely surfaces. I don't resent her. She believed what he presented. Many people do. Ambition can be intoxicating, but I've learned something about myself through all of this. I am not background infrastructure. I am not an emotional shock absorber. I am not the stable one in contrast to someone else's volatility. I am stable because I choose to be. There's a difference. At work, colleagues have begun involving me in strategic planning meetings, not just compliance review. I speak more directly, not louder, just clearer. When someone assumes I'll handle the details without consultation, I correct gently but firmly. Let's decide that together. It's a small sentence. It changes everything. The greatest shift hasn't been legal or financial. It's internal. For years, I equated harmony with virtue. If I kept things smooth, I was doing the right thing. Now I understand that harmony without consent is an imbalance disguised as peace. I don't regret protecting the house. I don't regret freezing the funds. And I don't regret the discomfort that followed. Because the discomfort exposed the structure. I used to believe that strength required confrontation, raised voices, decisive declarations. Now I know strength can look like paperwork filed on time, like questions asked, like refusing to confirm something that isn't true. The silver fountain pen my father left me sits on my desk still. I used it to sign the dispute notice. I used it again to sign the revised ownership agreement. Same pen. Different intention. Home, I've realized, is not just brick and mortar. It's boundary. It's clarity. It's the refusal to be repositioned without consent. If someone met me today, they might still call me steady, but they would not call me invisible. And if they tried, I would correct them, calmly. If you've listened this far, you might expect a dramatic ending, a triumphant speech, a public apology, a moment where someone wins. But real life rarely resolves that way. The house was protected. The sale was rescinded. Boundaries were rewritten. That's the outcome. But the real lesson wasn't about property. It was about perception. For years, I believed being calm meant being good. Being reliable meant being loving. Staying quiet meant being mature. And in many situations, that's true. But calm without boundaries becomes convenient for someone else. Reliability without consent becomes expectation. Silence without intention becomes permission. My brother didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as ambitious, urgent, vision-driven. What he underestimated was not my intelligence. It was my threshold. The quietest people in the room are often gathering information, measuring impact, deciding carefully. And when they finally act, it's rarely loud. It's precise. I didn't scream. I didn't humiliate. I didn't destroy him. I corrected the structure. Sometimes justice isn't revenge. It's restoration. Restoration of consent. Restoration of clarity. Restoration of self-respect. If you are the stable one in your family, if you are the person everyone assumes will smooth things over, if your silence has ever been mistaken for agreement, I hope this story reminds you of something simple. You are allowed to verify. You are allowed to require consent. You are allowed to file the document that changes everything. Not out of anger, out of alignment. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize the peace was costing you more than anyone noticed? I'd truly like to hear your thoughts.